Alright, folks, tonight we're diving into the extraordinary life of Queen Elizabeth I, that flame-haired Tudor powerhouse who transformed spinsterhood into a political weapon and made virginity sound less like virtue and more like a veiled threat. Before you get comfy, hit that like button if you're enjoying this, but only if you're genuinely vibing with my content. Drop a comment about where you're watching from and your local time. I'm always fascinated by our global audience. Now, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for some ambient noise, and let's begin tonight's journey together. Elizabeth Tudor's origin story didn't start with lullabies. It began with an executioner's blade. Born in 1533 to Boleyn and Henry VIII, who basically embodied a walking midlife crisis, Elizabeth entered this world as a royal heir only to be demoted faster than a court jester caught cheating at cards. Her mother got the chop on charges of adultery, incest, and witchcraft, or as modern historians call it. Henry got bored. At age 2, Elizabeth became the kid with the headless mom, and Parliament officially branded her illegitimate. Talk about being cancelled before you could even read. From princess to political liability with the stroke of a pen, toddler Elizabeth got shipped off to the countryside like a PR disaster needing containment. Her household staff got downsized, allowance slashed, and courtiers pretended she didn't exist unless they needed a cautionary tale about bad marriages. One day she's your grace, the next just that ginger kid with the executed mother. But here's where Elizabeth broke the mold. Most in her position would have grown up bitter or writing angsty poetry. Not Elizabeth. She became the ultimate overachiever, mastering Latin, Greek, French, philosophy, and theology while learning exactly zero about trust. Fluent in 5 languages, but emotionally fluent in none, she adopted her personal motto at age 9, Video et taceo, I see and stay silent, which is pretty heavy for a 3rd grader. But it was brilliant strategy. She played the long game, blending into the royal wallpaper while mentally cataloging everyone who might someday deserve poetic revenge. She watched Henry's revolving door of wives and learned 2 vital lessons. 1. Never get attached, and 2. Never rely on a man with daddy issues and a scepter. While others scrambled for the king's favor, Elizabeth perfected emotional detachment in hostile environments. She weaponized observation like kids weaponize sarcasm. Being royal might sound glamorous, but for Elizabeth it was less fairy tale and more Hunger Games with extra Latin conjugations and emotional trauma. After her bastardization, she was raised with just enough dignity to avoid scandal and just enough neglect to know she wasn't wanted. Her education? World class. Her tutors? The best. But the real curriculum? Learning to survive a royal family that made soap operas look tame. Her half-siblings were walking cautionaries. Mary, Catholic zealot with a persecution complex, and Edward, sickly Protestant kid surrounded by nobles playing deadly musical chairs with the crown. Elizabeth kept her opinions locked down and her metaphorical daggers sharp. She mastered the art of non-committal nodding, pious with Protestants, solemn with Catholics. Whoever held power, she was just the quiet girl in the corner translating Cicero, definitely not plotting anything, probably. Then there were the stepmothers. So many stepmothers. Catherine Parr, wife number 6, actually treated her well, supporting her education and offering something resembling maternal warmth. But then Catherine married Thomas Seymour after Henry's death, and things got problematic. Seymour, 50% ambition, 50% walking HR violation, started behaving inappropriately with teen Elizabeth. Early morning visits, tickling games, garden chases. Even by Tudor standards, this wasn't normal. The scandal got covered up, but the message was clear. Elizabeth was a political pawn, a potential princess, and a liability with great bone structure. By her teens, Elizabeth had witnessed enough betrayals, schemes, and near executions to qualify as a Tudor war veteran. But rather than breaking, she just got better at hiding her reactions. In Tudor England, survival wasn't about strength, it was about strategy, and Elizabeth was already winning. In 1554, Elizabeth received a concerning invitation from half-sister Mary, now Queen of England and full-time Catholic enforcer. The occasion? Possible treason charges and imprisonment. Mary was dealing with Wyatt's rebellion, Protestant uprising, and while rebels claimed they opposed Mary's Spanish marriage, Elizabeth's name kept accidentally coming up in interrogations. You know, the classic "she probably knew something" vibe that gets royals locked up. So Elizabeth got hauled to the Tower of London, where royals either awaited execution or miraculous redemption. Riding through Traitor's Gate in the rain, 20-something Elizabeth must have wondered if this was history's worst family reunion. But here's the Elizabeth twist. Instead of panicking, she calmly maintained innocence and politely declined to die. She even carved her name into a tower wall, because why not autograph your potential execution site? She refused to be broken. When guards left her in damp cells or tried to scare confessions from her, Elizabeth stayed composed. No screaming, no sobbing, not even the dramatic fainting expected of noble women. Mary couldn't find enough evidence for execution, always a nice legal technicality. So after 2 months, Elizabeth got transferred to house arrest. Better views, fewer rats, same surveillance. This ordeal could have destroyed her. Instead, it sharpened her. She walked into the tower a potential victim, walked out a future queen with a mental list titled "People to Handle Later." When Mary died in 1558, Europe expected chaos. England had been burning Protestants, flirting with Spain, and nearing civil war. The country was broke, anxious, and surrounded by enemies, like a Tudor group chat gone horribly wrong. Then came Elizabeth, not the obvious choice. Half the court remembered her as that redhead with the Tower record. Others assumed she'd get quietly married off to some obscure cousin. But when childless Mary died, the crown had few options. Elizabeth didn't wait for permission. She rode into London to cheers that sounded like national relief. No more burnings. No more Spanish drama. Someone who could read Latin without starting a rebellion. Her January 1559 coronation was a logistical nightmare. Frozen streets, chaotic processions, nobles unsure whether to treat her as queen or political wildcard. But Elizabeth didn't care. She stood before the nation in golden white robes, basically screaming surprise. I lived. From day one, she made clear this wouldn't be a reign of apologies. No groveling to Catholics, no marriage to please Spain, no letting advisors rule while she waved politely. Instead, she delivered the kind of speech that made bishops squirm in their seats, not with fire and brimstone, but with calculated ambiguity. She promised justice, stability, and national unity, all while artfully dodging any firm declaration about her religious leanings, marital prospects, or political agenda. It was political theater at its finest, vague enough to keep everyone guessing, yet commanding enough to silence doubters. The moment Elizabeth took the throne, the marriage proposals flooded in like pigeons to breadcrumbs. France, Spain, Sweden, even her own courtiers, lined up with eligible bachelors, dashing Catholic nobles, Protestant princes with questionable facial hair but excellent land holdings, and ambitious second sons hoping to trade their family name for a crown. Because in 16th century Europe, a queen ruling alone wasn't just unusual, it was terrifying. What if she made decisions while emotional? What if she refused to hand the reins to some duke who could barely govern his own wine cellar? But Elizabeth had a secret weapon. She had zero intention of marrying. She knew the second she picked a husband, she'd become queen consort of whoever, instead of the actual ruler of England. And that wasn't happening. After a lifetime of surviving royal instability, she wasn't about to surrender power to the first man who could quote Virgil between sword fights. So she played the long game. Publicly, she kept everyone guessing, flirting with ambassadors, accepting portraits of potential suitors, even entertaining negotiations for years. Privately, she rejected them all. She strung along proposals like a fisherman with too many lines in the water, reeling them in just enough to keep foreign powers hopeful before cutting them loose. And in doing so, she crafted one of history's most brilliant political identities, the Virgin Queen. Not because she was celibate, historians still debate that, but because she turned spinsterhood into a weapon. She didn't just refuse marriage, She sacralized her single status. "I am already married to England," she declared, draping herself in symbolism. It was poetic, powerful, and politically bulletproof. No foreign prince could claim her throne if she framed her chastity as divine devotion. And frankly, none of them were worth the paperwork anyway. Kings kept trying. Philip II of Spain, her late sister's widower, sent increasingly desperate proposals, and, eventually, warships. The Duke of Alençon, decades her junior, showed up in person, hoping youthful charm might sway her. Elizabeth entertained them all, dancing with ambassadors, praising portraits, even letting Alençon call her Petite Grenouille, little fraud, in affectionate letters. But at the end of the day, no ring, no heir, no compromise. By refusing to marry, she kept every European court on edge. No one knew who England might ally with, or if it would ally at all. It wasn't just political independence, it was a masterclass in power hoarding, and she made it look effortless. Once Elizabeth had secured her throne and politely swatted away every marriage proposal like flies at a banquet, she turned her attention to managing her court, a glittering nest of vipers in lace collars. Her council was a mix of loyalists, opportunists, and deeply confused men still adjusting to taking orders from someone without a beard. But Elizabeth had one advantage. She'd spent her life watching powerful people make mistakes. Now, she made sure she didn't. Running court politics under Elizabeth was like playing chess blindfolded on a rocking ship during a storm. Except the queen could see the whole board and occasionally whispered checkmate just to watch everyone sweat. Her favorite tactic? Keeping everyone guessing. Titles were granted slowly, rewards given sparingly, and trust never handed out wholesale. If a courtier got too comfortable, she'd remind them, gently or witheringly, that proximity to the throne wasn't a retirement plan. One day you were her sweet Robin, Robert Dudley's nickname. The next, you were being shipped to Ireland with a polite letter and zero military funding. Even her closest advisor, William Cecil, spent decades trying to decipher what she really meant when she said, perhaps. Spoiler, it meant no. But she never said it outright, because slamming doors was bad politics. Elizabeth preferred leaving them slightly ajar, just enough for ambitious men to trip over their own egos. She also had a flair for theatrical delay. Decisions took weeks, sometimes months, not because she was indecisive, but because every day of uncertainty made her court more dependent on her. Nothing happened without her signature, and her signature was in no rush. Flattery was currency at her court, but you had to be careful. One compliment too earnest, and she'd roast you publicly. One step too close, and you might find yourself promoted to some remote posting. No one ever knew what she was truly thinking, which was exactly how she liked it. Elizabeth didn't just sit on the throne, she performed it. Eyes always watching, smile always calculated, power always just out of reach. Her court didn't govern her, it revolved around her. Elizabeth I didn't just rule England. She dressed for the part so aggressively that her wardrobe deserved its own diplomatic corps. Where most noblewomen wore velvet and pearls to show status, Elizabeth wore them like armor stitched with political manifestos. Her gowns weren't clothes, they were propaganda. Towering ruffs, intricate embroidery, jewels that could bankrupt a duke, all carefully arranged to scream one message. I am the state, and I am not here for your nonsense. She turned her face into a mask of myth. White lead makeup gave her an eerie, almost divine pallor. Her wigs, elaborate, towering, occasionally weaponized, reinforced the image of eternal youth and unshakable authority. Never mind the lead poisoning. Looking immortal was worth the migraines. Elizabeth used fashion as psychological warfare. When she wore white, it wasn't innocence, it was invincibility. When she wore black, it wasn't mourning, it was menace. Her colors, fabrics, and jewels weren't chosen for beauty, but for effect. She entered every room like she owned not just the palace, but the very air inside it. And here's the kicker, no one else was allowed to copy her. Sumptuary laws banned certain fabrics and colors for anyone outside the royal family. The message was clear, you may dress up, but you will never dress like me. Even her portraits were tightly controlled. Artists couldn't just paint her mid-blink or mid-frown. She had an official mask of youth, a standardized face template painters had to follow, so she always appeared ageless. Tudor-era Photoshop, basically. But beneath the silks and gemstones was cold calculation. Elizabeth understood that image was power. If she looked untouchable, people would think twice before challenging her. If she seemed otherworldly, they might forget she was just a mortal woman navigating a man's world. Elizabeth I didn't just rule a kingdom. She micromanaged it like a CEO with trust issues and a suspicious amount of free time. While most monarchs delegated tasks like foreign policy, religious reform, and not bankrupting the realm, Elizabeth preferred the hands-on approach. Letters passed through her fingers. Speeches were edited personally. Military campaigns, she weighed in. Portraits, approved or destroyed. Even the font size of royal proclamations probably had to pass the "does this make me look weak?" test. Her council, led by William Cecil, her long-suffering chief advisor, often found themselves trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare, submitting proposals, receiving them back with 20 margin notes in the Queen's spidery handwriting, and then being asked why it wasn't done yesterday. Working for Elizabeth meant surviving in a constant state of polite panic. She wasn't cruel, just relentless. Courtiers dreaded her icy glares. Ambassadors sweated through doublets during audiences. Even Parliament tiptoed carefully. She once left them waiting 25 years for an answer on marriage. That's not a queen. That's a woman who turned ghosting into statecraft. And let's talk about correspondence. Elizabeth lived for letters. She read them, revised them, sometimes rewrote them entirely. If a diplomat's draft sounded too meek, she'd tear it up. Too bold, same fate. She understood words were weapons, and she made sure hers hit harder than a cavalry charge. She also ran Europe's most efficient spy network. Francis Walsingham, her spy master, built a proto-MI6 that intercepted letters, cracked codes, and sniffed out plots with terrifying efficiency. If you were conspiring against Elizabeth, chances are she already had your encrypted message decrypted, underlined in red ink, and ready for dramatic reading at council. All this control served a purpose. Elizabeth trusted no one. Not her nobles, not foreign allies, not even most of humanity. She'd seen what happened when power slipped, cough her father's 6 wives cough, and she never planned to let go. The result? A queen who didn't just sit on the throne. She operated it like a one-woman HR department, war office, PR firm, and 24/7 crisis hotline. And if anyone complained, they were welcome to try running the kingdom themselves. For about 5 seconds. In 1588, Spain made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed England would be an easy target. On paper, it made sense. Spain had the world's largest navy, bottomless gold from the Americas, and King Philip II, a man so devout he basically had God on speed dial. England, smaller fleet, empty treasury, and a queen who still hadn't picked a husband or heir. The whole country looked held together by parchment and Protestant guilt. But Elizabeth didn't panic. She suited up, literally. As the Spanish Armada approached, she rode to Tilbury where her troops were camped and delivered one of history's most electrifying speeches. Wearing a white velvet dress with a breastplate over it, because why not look like a war goddess who moonlights as a wedding cake? She declared, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too." Translation: yes, I'm unmarried and female. Try me. It worked. Morale skyrocketed. The speech echoed through the ranks. And while Elizabeth didn't personally lead ships into battle, she was bold, not insane. Her presence was a lightning rod. England wasn't rolling over for anyone. Then came the twist, weather and luck. The invincible Armada got pummeled by smaller, faster English ships, set ablaze by fire vessels, and finally scattered by what everyone called a Protestant wind. Some Spanish sailors drowned. Others limped home starving and humiliated. Elizabeth didn't waste the moment. She spun the victory into a full-blown PR campaign. Medals struck, paintings commissioned. God is officially English now vibes. It wasn't just a military win. it was a branding win. The Virgin Queen had faced down Europe's superpower and sent it home soggy and defeated. Never underestimate a woman in pearls and armor. If there's one thing monarchs are supposed to do, besides not getting overthrown, it's produce an heir, preferably one who isn't a walking scandal in tights. But Elizabeth I, ever the innovator, skipped that step entirely. From day one, everyone asked, "So, who's next?" Her answer for 44 years was essentially, "You'll find out when I do." No marriage, no children, and most shockingly, no official successor ever named. It was like owning a bus company and refusing to hire a driver for tomorrow. Reckless? Maybe. Strategic? Absolutely. By keeping the succession vague, Elizabeth prevented rivals from gaining traction. Naming an heir early would have been handing someone a crown-shaped invitation to start plotting her assassination. And after surviving the tower herself, she had zero interest in starring in that sequel. So she kept everyone guessing. Would it be Mary, Queen of Scots? Spoiler, no. Lost her head after too much scheming. James of Scotland? Maybe. But no promises. Foreign diplomats wrote frantic reports speculating. Her own advisors nagged. Elizabeth, with the grace of a cat ignoring its owner, refused. She once snapped at Parliament. "If I declared my successor, you might as well start digging my grave." But here's the genius. While publicly silent, she likely did favor James VI of Scotland, future James I of England. She just never said it aloud, because saying it made it real, and making it real meant sharing the spotlight. And Elizabeth wasn't about to dim hers for anyone. While Elizabeth I was busy dodging assassins, swatting marriage proposals, and refusing to name an heir, she also accidentally sparked one of history's greatest cultural explosions. Welcome to the Elizabethan Golden Age, aka when England suddenly got really good at poetry, drama, and being extra. Let's start with the obvious, William Shakespeare. The Bard wrote most of his iconic plays under Elizabeth's reign: Macbeth, Hamlet, A Midsummer Night's Dream. All those cheerful tales about murder, ghosts, and teenage romance gone horribly wrong. Elizabeth adored theater, frequently hosting performances at court, even when stuffy advisors complained plays were corrupting the youth with too many dirty puns. But she didn't just enjoy art, she weaponized it. Theater was the Netflix of the 16th century. If people were watching plays, they weren't rioting. And if those plays happened to feature wise, powerful monarchs triumphing over chaos, even better, she didn't just inspire playwrights. Poets worshipped her in verse. Portraitists painted her as an ageless goddess. Explorers named colonies after her. Virginia, anyone. Even science and navigation got a boost. While Elizabeth wasn't sailing herself, she backed men like Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake, who returned with maps, loot, and a lot of new enemies. Culturally, England went from rainy backwater to global hotspot. And Elizabeth didn't just watch, she curated. She controlled her image, patronized geniuses, and surrounded herself with people who made her reign look not just powerful, but legendary. She wasn't just a queen. She was a living myth, a ruler who wielded aesthetics and wit as effectively as swords. Under her, England didn't just survive. It performed. Elizabeth I's court wasn't just about politics and power plays. It was a simmering cauldron of romantic tension that would make modern soap operas look tame. If you thought a queen without husband or children meant no drama, think again. The Tudor court under Elizabeth became history's most elaborate game of royal flirtation, where every glance carried political weight and every suitor played for keeps. Enter Robert Dudley, the man who redefined complicated relationship. Tall, devastatingly handsome, and with ambition to match his charm, Dudley wasn't just Elizabeth's favorite. He was her childhood friend, her rock during the Tower years, and possibly the love she could never publicly claim. Their relationship became the stuff of court gossip and diplomatic nightmares. When Dudley's wife Amy Robsart died under suspicious circumstances, falling downstairs, how Tudor, the scandal nearly toppled Elizabeth's reign. Yet she stood by him, promoting him to Earl of Leicester while carefully never crossing the line into marriage. It was political judo at its finest, keeping Europe guessing while maintaining just enough distance to preserve her power. The foreign suitors came like waves crashing against England's shores. Philip II of Spain, her late sister's widower, proposed repeatedly despite their religious differences and despite being the human equivalent of a Spanish Inquisition pamphlet. The Duke of Anjou, 20 years her junior, arrived with French flair and pet names, Ma chère grenouille, my dear frog. But even his youthful charm couldn't sway her. Elizabeth danced with them all, sometimes literally, in a carefully choreographed performance of royal courtship. Her genius lay in turning marriage negotiations into geopolitical chess. Each suitor represented a potential alliance, and Elizabeth played them like a virtuoso. She'd dangle the possibility of marriage just long enough to secure favorable trade terms or military neutrality, then gracefully withdraw when pressed for commitment. The French ambassador once complained she had 1,000 eyes and not one of them sincere, which was precisely the point. Meanwhile, the court itself became a pressure cooker of repressed desire and political ambition. Younger courtiers like Walter Raleigh and Christopher Hatton vied for her attention with poetry, lavish gifts, and carefully cultivated personas. Raleigh famously spread his cloak over a puddle for her, a gesture both romantic and calculated, typical of the Elizabethan courtier's balancing act. Elizabeth rewarded such displays with smiles, nicknames, water for Raleigh, referencing his naval exploits, and the occasional monopoly, but never her hand. The emotional toll of this perpetual performance was immense. Contemporary accounts describe Elizabeth's famous temper, hurling slippers at messengers, boxing ears of careless ladies-in-waiting, as evidence of the strain. Her closest confidant, Blanche Parry, reportedly kept a ledger of the Queen's headaches, which became more frequent as the years passed and the marriage question remained unresolved. Yet through it all, Elizabeth maintained the fiction of the Virgin Queen, not just as political strategy, but as a carefully constructed identity. When painters depicted her, they followed strict guidelines: pale complexion, elaborate gowns, symbols of purity and power. The famous Armada portrait shows her with her hand resting on the globe, as if to say the world itself was her true consort. By her later years, the once vibrant queen had become something more and less than human. The lead-based makeup that preserved her youthful image in portraits slowly poisoned her in reality. The elaborate wigs hid thinning hair. The stiff gowns concealed an aging body. Yet she continued the performance, because the performance was the power. When the Earl of Essex, her last favorite, 30 years her junior, dared to rebel in 1601, Elizabeth's response was characteristically ruthless. The man who had once entertained her with lavish tournaments and whispered sweet nothings now found himself facing the executioner's axe. Even in her late 60s, Elizabeth understood the fundamental rule of her court. Affection ended where treason began. The final years were lonely ones. Most of her original courtiers had died. The new generation waited impatiently for her passing and the succession of James VI of Scotland. Yet Elizabeth, ever the consummate performer, refused to yield the stage. When urged to name her successor outright, she reportedly replied, "A king does not die in the bed of his people's expectations." Her death in 1603 marked the end of an extraordinary balancing act. For 45 years, she had navigated the treacherous waters between womanhood and sovereignty, between desire and duty, between the personal and the political. In the end, Elizabeth didn't just refuse to marry. She redefined what it meant to be a queen. By the winter of 1602, Elizabeth I was no longer the vibrant, flame-haired queen who had dazzled courts and terrified ambassadors. At 69, she was a living relic, her face a porcelain mask of white lead, her body frail beneath layers of embroidered gowns, her temper as sharp as the daggers she'd once metaphorically wielded. The Tudor fire was burning low, but Elizabeth, ever the performer, refused to let anyone see the embers fading. Courtiers tiptoed around her like mice avoiding a sleeping lion. One wrong word could trigger legendary outbursts. Gloves hurled at messengers, slippers launched at careless maids, or worse, the dreaded silence that meant someone was about to lose their position or head. Her inner circle had thinned. William Cecil long dead, Robert Dudley gone to the grave still hoping for her hand, even her sharp-tongued spymaster Walsingham buried years prior. The new generation of advisors eyed her with a mix of reverence and impatience, already calculating their futures under King James of Scotland. But Elizabeth wouldn't yield. Not yet. She still held court, still demanded reports, still edited speeches with her famously spidery handwriting. Yet the cracks were showing. When the Earl of Essex, her last reckless favorite, had rebelled the previous year, she'd signed his death warrant with the same icy resolve she'd shown for traitors decades earlier. But this time, rumors swirled that she'd wept in private. The woman who'd built her reign on emotional control was finally, quietly, unraveling. Then came the nightmares. Servants whispered of the Queen waking in the dead of night, screaming about her father's wives or the tower's cold stones. Some said she hallucinated Amy Robsart's ghost at the foot of her bed, Dudley's dead wife, forever the shadow over their bond. Others claimed she muttered to long-dead rivals like Mary, Queen of Scots, as if the past had become more real than the present. The final blow came in early 1603. Elizabeth caught a chill that became a fever, then something worse. Her physicians bled her, naturally, prescribed perfumed broths, uselessly, and finally admitted what everyone knew. The Queen was dying. But even death wouldn't be allowed to rush her. For days, she refused to lie down, propped upright in her privy chamber like a doll in a display case. To rest, she believed, was to surrender. When her advisors gently pressed about the succession, she reportedly lifted a skeletal finger toward her ring, the coronation ring symbolizing her marriage to England, which had to be sawed off when her joints swelled. The message was clear. She'd kept her vows. She'd never taken a king. On March 24, 1603, between midnight and 3 a.m., Elizabeth Tudor slipped away so quietly that for hours, no one dared confirm it. The woman who'd ruled for 44 years outlived assassination plots and turned her virginity into a political shield was gone without fanfare. When James VI of Scotland was proclaimed king, London exhaled, relieved, curious, but already nostalgic for the era ending with her. The aftermath, a kingdom remade. Elizabeth's death wasn't just the passing of a monarch. It was the closing of a dynasty. The Tudors, those brilliant, bloody, larger-than-life rulers, were finished. In their place came the Stuarts. James with his Scottish brogue, his male heirs, and his very un-Elizabethan belief that kings ruled by divine right, not political theater. Almost immediately, the myth-making began. Painters rushed to immortalize her as Gloriana, the eternal virgin. Poets compared her to Astrea, the star maiden of justice. Playwrights, including Shakespeare, no fool, dropped flattering references to the fair Vestal enthroned in the West. Even her enemies conceded she'd been something. A queen who'd taken a bankrupt, fractured nation and made it formidable. But beneath the glittering eulogies, the reckoning began. James' courtiers smirked at Elizabeth's outdated fashions. Her beloved maids of honor were pensioned off or married hastily to Scots nobles. The new king, while respectful, made clear that his England would be different. Less dance of veiled threats, more straight talk and straight drinking. Yet Elizabeth's shadow proved inescapable. For decades, any Stuart misstep prompted comparisons to the late Queen's time. When James' son Charles lost his head in 1649, old men nodded grimly. Elizabeth would have never allowed this. Even the monarchy's restoration in 1660 came with wistful talk of Tudor glory. The legacy, virgin, queen, icon. Centuries later, Elizabeth I remains the ultimate Rorschach test of power. To feminists, she's the original woman who had it all, if all means sacrificing personal happiness for political survival. To conservatives, she's proof that tradition can be bent but not broken. To LGBTQ+ scholars, her refusal to marry sparks debates. Was it strategy, trauma, or something more private? Her reign birthed cultural touchstones we still use. The Armada portrait pose copied by every power suit-wearing CEO, the Virgin Queen archetype echoed in everything from the Hunger Games to the Crown. Modern politicians still study her speeches for masterclasses in persuasive ambiguity. And yet, the woman herself stays just out of reach. We have her letters, her portraits, her carefully stage-managed myths. But the real Elizabeth? The one who whispered to Dudley in moonlit gardens, who threw inkpots in rage, who carved her name into tower walls as a girl facing execution. She remains where she always was, behind the mask, one step ahead. In the end, Elizabeth didn't just rewrite the rules of queenship. She proved that in a world of kings, a woman could be the most dangerous player at the table, if she never let them see her tell. The moment Elizabeth's coffin was sealed in Westminster Abbey's vault, England began performing a peculiar national ritual, the simultaneous deification and dismantling of her legacy. James I's coronation procession deliberately echoed Elizabethan imagery. The new king's robes shimmered with Tudor roses, his speeches name-dropped our royal sister, and court poets hastily rewrote their odes to flatter the Scottish line. But beneath this performative continuity, the tectonic plates of power were shifting. James, scholarly and blunt where Elizabeth had been theatrical and elusive, made his disdain for her governing style immediately clear. Within months, he dismantled her carefully cultivated Virgin Queen iconography, replacing it with his British Solomon persona, canceled the annual Accession Day tilts, those lavish jousting tournaments celebrating Elizabeth's reign, ordered the melting down of her commemorative medals to mint new coinage bearing his profile. Yet Elizabeth's ghost proved harder to exorcise than James anticipated. When his 1605 gunpowder plot nearly obliterated Parliament, Londoners spontaneously compared the Catholic conspirators to Elizabeth's old foes. When his pacifist policies left English ships vulnerable to Spanish attacks, sailors grumbled about what Gloriana would have done. Even James' own son, Prince Henry, became an unwitting revivalist. The teenage heir obsessively collected Elizabethan armor, staged mock naval battles commemorating the Armada victory, and reportedly kept a locket with the late Queen's portrait. This cultural tug-of-war reached its peak in 1612, when London's theaters, those very institutions Elizabeth had patronized, began staging a wave of lost princess plays. These dramas, like Thomas Decker's The Whore of Babylon, allegorized Elizabeth's reign as a golden age of Protestant purity under siege. The message was unmistakable. England missed its warrior queen. By 1618, as James struggled to manage the 30 Years' War, a full-blown Elizabethan nostalgia industry had emerged. Print shops sold unauthorized and heavily embellished memoirs of life at Gloriana's court. Secondhand markets boomed for out-of-fashion rough collars and pearl-studded gowns. Aging sea dogs like Walter Raleigh penned manifestos contrasting Elizabeth's decisiveness with James' dithering. The most telling moment came in 1623, when James' daughter Elizabeth, namesake of the late Queen, became a rallying figure for Protestant forces in Europe. The parallels were irresistible. Another Elizabeth, another religious war, another chance for England to play the savior. That the princess spoke Czech and ruled from Prague only deepened the mystique. When James died in 1625, his funeral sermon tellingly devoted more verses to praising Elizabeth's 40 years of peace than to his own reign. The Stuart dynasty would spend the next century wrestling with this impossible standard until another remarkable queen, and finally reconciled the two legacies in 1707 by creating Great Britain itself. The Elizabethan afterlife, how a dead queen refused to stay buried. As the 17th century unfolded, Elizabeth I achieved something no monarch had ever accomplished. She became more powerful in death than in life. This wasn't mere nostalgia. It was the birth of England's first political cult of personality. The phenomenon manifested in three distinct waves that reshaped British identity. Wave 1, the Protestant Shield, 1603 to 1649. In the decades immediately following her death, Elizabeth became the ultimate Protestant martyr figure despite having never been martyred. Puritan preachers reinvented her as the defender of the true faith, conveniently ignoring her actual religious pragmatism. When Charles I's Catholic-leaning policies sparked the English Civil War, parliamentarian troops marched into battle carrying banners embroidered with Elizabeth's face, the original, iconic feminist resistance imagery. The propaganda reached absurd heights. Pamphlets claimed Spanish Armada ships had spontaneously combusted when sailors glimpsed her portrait. Actual historical records show weather and tactics won that battle. A 1642 woodcut depicted Elizabeth literally ascending to heaven while trampling Pope Paul IV, an image that would have horrified the real queen who maintained diplomatic relations with Rome. Wave 2, the Imperial Blueprint, 1650 to 1783. As England built its overseas empire, Elizabeth's reign was retroactively cast as the dawn of British global dominance. Francis Drake's circumnavigation, once considered piracy, became reframed as visionary exploration. The East India Company commissioned paintings showing Elizabeth blessing their first voyages, though she died years before its founding. This repackaging peaked during Britain's 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, against France. Prime Minister William Pitt consciously modeled his strategy on Elizabethan privateering, dubbing his naval commanders Drake's spiritual heirs. When Britain emerged victorious, claiming vast New World territories, historians promptly declared this the fulfillment of Elizabeth's grand design. Despite zero evidence, she'd contemplated transatlantic colonies. Wave 3, the Victorian Fantasy, 1837 to 1901. Queen Victoria's reign saw Elizabeth transformed from historical figure to fairy tale archetype. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood painted her as a flame-haired goddess floating above stormy seas. Children's books sanitized her reign into moral fables about good Protestant queens versus wicked Catholic plotters. This romanticized version reached its zenith in 1897, when Victoria's Diamond Jubilee prompted comparisons to Elizabeth's supposed Golden Age. The irony was delicious. Victoria, a devoted wife and mother of 9, being celebrated as the second coming of the Virgin Queen. The colonial exhibition accompanying the Jubilee even included a replica Armada portrait with Victoria's face superimposed over Elizabeth's body, the ultimate imperial Photoshop. The modern metamorphosis, 20th century present. Today's Elizabeth exists in Schrodinger's paradox, simultaneously reclaimed and reinvented by every ideological faction. Feminists celebrate her strategic singleness while glossing over her suppression of other women. Brexiters invoke her stand against Europe despite her constant diplomacy with continental powers. LGBTQ+ activists claim her as an icon despite ambiguous evidence about her personal life. Even her physical remains participate in this dance. When archaeologists scanned her Westminster Abbey tomb in 2018, they found 3 bodies: Elizabeth, her half-sister Mary I, and an unidentified third skeleton. The discovery sparked wild theories until historians recalled that Mary, Queen of Scots' son James I had reburied his mother nearby. The ultimate irony? England's greatest queen shares eternity with the 2 women she most feared becoming: the husband-dominated Catholic, Mary I, and the executed rival, Mary Stuart. Perhaps this explains Elizabeth's enduring power. Like Shakespeare's plays, her legacy is an empty vessel we keep filling with our own anxieties and aspirations. The real woman, calculating, contradictory, fiercely intelligent, remains safely entombed, while her ghost walks freely through our political imagination. Let me tell you a secret about Elizabeth Tudor: she's still performing. Even now, 400 years after her death, the woman just won't leave the stage. Picture this. It's 1928, and a group of suffragettes are marching down Whitehall, their banners flapping in the London rain. At the front, one woman holds aloft a portrait of Elizabeth like a holy icon. "She ruled alone," they chant. Never mind that the real Elizabeth had her cousin Mary locked up for 19 years before finally signing the death warrant. The legend's always been more convenient than the truth. Fast forward to 1975, a smoky gay bar in Soho, where a drag queen in a red wig and pearl collar lip syncs to I Will Survive. The regulars cheer. They've nicknamed her Bessie for the night. Our first lesbian queen. Someone toasts, raising a glass to the cracked mirror behind the bar. Outside, a historian sighs into his whiskey. If only they knew she had a man's head chopped off for calling her that. Now it's 2016. A Brexit campaign bus rolls past a mural of Elizabeth glaring at the European Union flag. She kept England sovereign, the MP bellows through his megaphone. Never mind that the real Elizabeth spent half her reign begging the Ottoman Sultan for military alliances. Here's the thing about Elizabeth. She was always 3 steps ahead. When Hollywood came calling, she gave Kate Blanchett cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and a stare that could freeze the Thames. For the history books, she left just enough love letters to Dudley to keep us guessing, but not enough to ever be sure. And for the tourists who file past her tomb today, she left a single pearl rolling across the floor when no one's looking. Were you happy? A little girl whispers to the marble effigy. Somewhere in the shadows, a rustle of silk. A whisper, "Darling, I was magnificent." The candles in the privy chamber burned low that March night in 1603. Outside, the Thames lay black and silent under a starless sky, as if all of London was holding its breath. Elizabeth Tudor, once the flame-haired girl who'd outwitted death in the Tower, now lay motionless on her cushions. The white lead makeup she'd worn like armor for 40 years had cracked into riverbeds across her face. Her ladies hovered like nervous sparrows, afraid to touch the woman who'd spent a lifetime refusing to be touched. "Your Majesty," Robert Cecil began, clutching the unsigned succession papers. A skeletal hand twitched. The Queen's eyes flew open, 2 chips of flint in the candlelight. "Little man," she rasped, "do you think I don't know you've been writing to Scotland?" Cecil palmed. Even dying, she saw everything. Some say her last word was pray. Others swear it was Dudley. But the maid who washed the body told her granddaughter a different story. That when they peeled away the layers, the stiff brocade, the whalebone corset, the linen shifts stained with rosewater, they found clutched in Elizabeth's hand a lock of hair, tied with a scrap of velvet the color of rust. Like it had been waiting there 50 years, the maid whispered. Like she'd been keeping it warm. And that's the thing about Elizabeth. She took her secrets to the grave. Left us chasing shadows in old letters, reading treason between the lines of love poems, squinting at portraits for clues in the set of a jaw or the twist of a pearl. For centuries later, we're still staging productions about her life, rewriting her lines, arguing over the casting. But here's the truth no biographer will admit. The greatest performance of Elizabeth's reign began the moment she stopped breathing. Because dying? That was her masterpiece. The ultimate power move. Now she belongs to everyone and no one.